hello, everybody. Welcome from all over the world. Good to see you putting in the chat as well. Not only how prepared on a scale of 1 to 5 you feel for the future challenges that your organizations face, but also where you're dialing in from. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night. I see some of them. Thank you for sharing some time with us over the next hour. This is really going to be a very exciting hour. It's our Innovation at Work Deep Dive webinar series, but we're doing something really unique today. We have with us an incredible panel of 4 people as a collaboration between the MIT Sloan School and our friends across the ocean at IMD in Switzerland. And we're going to be having a conversation about this topic, preparing and leading a future-ready organization. And the conversation, we hope, will not just be among these really eminent 4 researchers and educators in this field, but also with all of you. So we really have designed this with the hope of it being a very interactive and engaging session to help not only you learn about this topic, but to help us learn about what are the challenges that you're facing and what are the things that collectively that we can do to help make sure that not only are we dealing with all of the challenges that face us in the immediate future, as in the coming moments, seconds, days, weeks, and months, but in the longer term future as well. What an important and fascinating topic. And I'm delighted to be joined here today. Let me just quickly go through and introduce our 4 panelists. I'll invite them to say a bit more about themselves as they begin to talk. But first up, we'll hear from Stephanie Woerner, who is a principal research scientist at MIT and the director of MIT's Center for Information Systems Research. Stephanie does a lot of research and the implications and applications of technology for organizations, and we'll be hearing, I think, a lot in the coming hour about her work and the work of her colleagues in the Center for Information Systems Research. We also have Kate Isaacs, another colleague from the Sloan School, who is a senior lecturer and an expert in leadership, and particularly distributed leadership and agile and nimble leadership, and all of the skills and characteristics that our leaders are going to need today, but will need in the future as well. So we'll be hearing from Kate. And then from IMD, we have Professor Mark Greeven, who one interesting thing about Mark that I've learned in the process of preparing for this webinar is that he's a fluent Chinese speaker. But more important than that, maybe even, is that he's really has deep research over many years on innovation in the context of China and Asia, as well as globally. And so we're looking forward to hearing from Mark and his work in China and for IMD. And we're also joined from IMD by Howard Yu, whose PhD was up the river from us today at Harvard, but he is the Lego Professor of Management and Innovation at IMD, and actually runs a research program at IMD that's all about understanding future readiness as well. So we have 4 researchers and faculty who study the future and future readiness and have been talking among each other about this topic, and we would love to invite them to share a little bit in turn about their work and their ideas on this topic, and then really get into a conversation between them and with all of you. And so first up, if I may I invite you, Stephanie, to share a little bit more about who you are and your work and your thoughts about this topic.
Sure. So I'm Stephanie Woerner, and I do research at MIT CISR on digital business models. How are companies going to make money in the digital economy, and about becoming future-ready digital business transformation, and on the digital savviness of senior executives and boards. And what I'm excited about right now in this webinar is to talk about why is digital transformation so important and so hard. One of the things that we have found in our research is that when we talk about a digital business transformation, we're not talking about doing one thing. We're actually talking about doing 2 things. One of them is instilling a discipline around your back office processes, your digital operational backbone, but at the same time, you're empowering your people to create digital offerings to engage your customers. And so that is the crux of why a digital business transformation is so difficult. You've got to innovate on one hand, but also pull out costs on the other hand. And as we did this research, we identified 4 pathways that companies could take to transform themselves. One was to really work on industrializing the back end first and then moving on to engaging customers. The second was to engage customers initially and then re-platform. The third was to kind of shift back and forth as stair steps. And then the fourth was to create a new business unit. And there are pros and cons to each one of these. And each of these can be a very good way of progressing your company and becoming more future ready. And I think one of the big things we want to talk about in this presentation are some of the big organizational challenges that organizations have to deal with. We call them explosions because that's often what they feel like to executives. And when I think about the 4 big organizational challenges, the first is around allocating your decision rights. Do you have the right people to lead those key decisions? And have you figured out, how you're going to give them authority and responsibility? And does everybody else in the organization know it? The second is around creating new ways of working. Every transformation we've studied is really moving from a very planned way, project driven, to a more iterative way of working. The third is developing a platform mindset. And then eventually you need to think about reorganizing the company or the organization, what we call organizational surgery, so that you've aligned what you're trying to do with the vision and the goals. And so that's kind of in a capsule what we've been doing. You're on mute, Peter.
Thank you for pointing that out. Thank you, Stephanie. That's a really, I think, helpful framework to start with. And perhaps we can sort of move straight into the question of what do the leaders look like and what skills do they need? Before I introduce you, Kate, I'm just curious what people who are watching might think is the answer to the question of, what are the skills and characteristics that are essential or going to be essential for future ready leaders. Feel free to put your thoughts about that in the chat while I hand over to Kate and invite her to say a little bit about what she's been doing and her thoughts about that question.
Great, thanks, Peter. And I'll be looking at the chat to see what your ideas are about what kinds of leadership skills are needed. I see Sophia has mentioned customer centricity, and that would be at the absolute top of my list as well. That is the top thing that organizations can do to be aligned around some kind of common purpose and vision. Is what do your customers want? So great thought, Sophia, and I see those coming in. Resilience, creativity, open-mindedness, communication, growth mindset, Paul, love that. So let me just summarize about 20 years of research in a minute or two around what I do around creating and leading distributed leadership organizations. So we are in an era where everybody wants to push power and decision-making down into the organization as far as possible, so that people who are actually interacting with customers on the front lines, who are in touch with changing trends, can make those rapid decisions without having to escalate them multiple layers up through the hierarchy, through that middle layer of clay of middle management that we sometimes talk about. So my research is about how are these kinds of organizations that are more team-based with flexible roles, that are flatter, less hierarchical, how are they designed and run? And it turns out that our research shows that there are 3 levels of leadership in these kinds of organizations. First of all, instead of it being the typical pyramid where the people who are the smartest are at the top making all the decisions, what nimble distributed organizations look like is they flip the hierarchy upside down, so that the senior leaders are actually at the bottom, if you will, designing what we call an innovation game board, so that engages everybody in the game and the fun and the science of innovation. And our research shows that there are several skills that these people who were formerly at the top, who are now at the, serving the game of innovation, they have a set of skills around being really clear about what not just the vision and strategy of the organization is, but its purpose. Why do we get out of bed in the morning and come to work? That's increasingly important for especially the younger generation of workers. Some recent research shows that 60 to 70% of millennials want to work for a purpose and values-driven organization, and we see that happening more and more. So those architecting leaders, or what we call the senior leaders, are really communicating, in charge of communicating the organization's purpose and its values, and doing that in a very simple way. And by the way, you can't just leave the values and the purpose on the wall. Those senior architecting leaders are responsible for getting those off the wall and into the water of the organization. How do they do that? Well, first and foremost, by modeling those and being responsible for bringing the culture to life inside the organization. So, and they're also doing what some colleagues at Sloan, Don Sull and Kathleen Eisenhart, call creating simple rules. So if you have a complicated strategy, how is anyone in the organization going to understand how to put that into practice? Well, it's through simple rules. For instance, we're not going to go after a new product innovation unless it's worth 500 million in the marketplace. So just some simple metrics to hit are part of what architecting leaders do to get people informed about how to make decisions on the ground. So that's one level of leader, designing the game board, the innovation game board, and there's lots of research about the practices and structures that they put in place too. I just mentioned a couple. The second level is what we call enabling leaders. So in our research shows that instead of a middle layer of clay of management that are blocking innovation, those folks are actually enabling innovation. They're coaching. They are coaching people to find and source their own answers as much as possible and help people develop their potential for innovation and develop professionally and personally. They're helping to connect initiatives throughout the organization and provide that connective tissue function. And they're communicating. They're helping to communicate that vision, that strategy, purpose, and values that's coming from senior leadership to everybody in the organization, and doing it in multiple ways, through video, through written communication, oral communication in multiple languages, by telling stories. So those enabling leaders are really important to connect and coordinate the activities of the organization. Third level of leaders, entrepreneurial leaders. And these are the folks who are, they're not frontline workers. They are not human resources. What they are entrepreneurial leaders who, yes, we want them to it's a key polarity. We want to free them up to act with freedom and creativity in the course of their work, whether it's interacting with a customer, whether it's inventing a new product. And we want to free them up, and we want them to be aligned. We want them to be aligned with the strategy of the organization and where we're going as a whole. So, and that's part of the role of the enabling leader, is to help that alignment to happen, but not in a command and control way. A lot of it happens through storytelling. Nimble organizations have a lot of very disciplined storytelling practices that they do alongside rigorous data collection about the customer experience. So let me stop there because my colleagues have other really important things to say. And Peter, I'll let you turn us to the next person.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. And while you've been talking, there's been a really lively discussion happening in the chat about what are the kind of leadership, not only qualities, but practices, particularly around communication. So maybe we can get onto that in a little bit. But in the meantime, I wanted to turn to, if we've been thinking about people for a second, let's think about organizations. Howard, you have been conducting research that benchmarks leading companies and organizations around the world on their future readiness. So could you tell us a little bit more about that research, and what are the hallmarks of future ready companies, in fact, that you found?
Sure. So at IMD, between Mark and myself, we've been focusing and paying a lot of attention on which organization are most future ready. And the way we do it is essentially almost like a 360 assessment to looking at whether an organization can, perform and transform at the same time. So we cover both US, European companies, as well as those in China. But Mark, if someone just come up and ask you, hey, what are the hallmarks for the most future ready organization? How would you explain that?
So Howard, I think the way we think about that is really, the perform, transform challenge, right? So at the one hand, a company needs to be able to reposition their core business, keep doing what they do well, build resilience, which requires typically new capabilities and pretty much a transformation of the organization, teams, and leaders themselves. While at the same time, leaders need to think about the future, right? They cannot mortgage out their future, and they have to think about how to build new growth engines. And those new growth engines are in themselves new transformations that require capabilities. So fundamentally, a future-ready organization and a future-ready leader is really good at identifying what are really the core capabilities that we need to build now, scale up now, so that we can survive and thrive today and actually build those growth engines for the future. So I think that's what it comes down to, right, Howard?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the unit of analysis here, in order to perform and transform, it sounds very straightforward, but it's hard to do because it does require company to scale up the next generation of capabilities. Because oftentimes what we see is organization getting trapped when they think about, oh, let's grow the new business on one side, or let's optimize our current operation, take our costs on the other side. It's an either or trade-off. But what we see is organization can break away from such conventional trade-off. They focus on capability buildings. So you think about, let's say, generative AI, everyone talk about, is actually not just around transforming your new businesses for new businesses, but it also helps you to optimize and make your current operation even more competitive. And that framing we find among executive and company are so critical because it allows an organization to share a common frame and language so that they don't just become compromise, but you in fact are excelling on both.
That's fascinating. One of the great debates, put this question to all of you, actually, I'm not sure who would answer it, that there's been over the ages as we think about sort of transformation and change is what's the best way for companies and leaders to think about doing that? Do we set up a skunk works and just have a small unit that we empower to go and do this very disruptive stuff, or do we try to really empower the entire organization to be sort of an engine of change? I'm just curious, Stephanie, in your research, what have you seen?
Well, we've seen companies do both, and we also, but you have to go and be disciplined about it. We have seen companies set up what we call skunk works. About 7% of future ready is around building that new unit. But the issue with building a new unit is, are you going to operate it as a separate business unit and it's just going to stay off to the side? And if that's the case, it's fine. But the hard thing is when you want to build the new unit, develop those skills, and then have the rest of the organization learn at the same time. And you can't do that by just saying, well, we're going to become future ready, or we're going to have a future ready unit over here. You really have to think about how do you bring those skills from the skunk works back into the mothership, as we call it at Scissor, and develop the skills of the organization. Because otherwise you really run the risk that you're going to have that skunk works really just operating alone, and your organization is going to be not future ready at all. I don't know, Howard, Mark, Kate, have you seen that happen also?
Yeah, Mark has an interesting observation of a bank in Thailand did exactly that. And I think, Stephanie, you pointing out you cannot just do skunk work on the side is absolutely critical, because it is about spreading that capability across. So Mark, tell us that personal observation you had.
I remember this conversation we had with the CEO of a Thai bank, one of the largest Thai commercial banks. And it was really funny because he was sitting on a stage with a big screen behind him. And at the left side, he had the cash cows, which were all his ongoing brands, traditional core business. And at the right side, he had all the new cool fintech startups, new technologies, all kinds of other stuff that he needed to build with his business for the future. And then he said, actually, one of the things he found out and what he started to do is getting lots and lots of talent in that new business, the new growth engines, with all the cool digital capabilities and all of that, realizing that if that capability sticks and stays only in that nice transform pillar, then actually it was not really going to work, right? It would work in a silo, would work for a while, and then over a time, actually that capability would not really help the business at the core. So what they started to do was actually laterally moving people from the transform business back to the so-called boring or the core business. And actually that transformation, that lateral transformation of moving people and mobilizing people throughout actually led to a mechanism which not only allowed the core business to leverage that new capability, but actually also allowed to transform a little bit of the culture of the organization as a whole by actually moving those people around the organization. So I remember this was a very interesting case for us, because the solution to this was, again, it was about people, and it was about how do we incentivize and move people flexibly around the organization to actually do that, not in isolation, but as an organization. So I think the real point of that example was really that perform, transform, focus on what is the key capability. It has to be organization-wide. It's an organizational-wide transformation.
Isabella in the chat, I think, was making some great points about this as well, that you were just talking there about the human dimensions and the human factors. So Kate, I'd love to learn more about what your research tells us about that. In particular, as you study organizations with these much more distributed kind of leadership models, it seems like, as important as it might be for the senior leader or senior leaders to be able to establish and communicate that vision, it's also really important, as Mark was just talking about, to bring people along. And what have you seen what's your advice to people who are really grappling with that challenge?
Well, we're talking about Gen AI right now, and we are in an era of major disruption all the time. And I know Indira mentioned sustainability. We've got so many different kinds of changes that are happening that have the potential to completely disrupt the way that we do business. Gen AI is the latest and greatest at the moment. In any kind of major change environment, as you say, Peter, it's imperative to bring your people along for the ride. And as leaders, we do not know all the answers all the time about how to proceed. We just don't. And we liken this journey of Gen AI and a lot of the business challenges that we face to finding your way forward on the foggy road. I mean, you can see a certain distance ahead, but not all the way. But you can navigate safely and effectively if you are, I'm going to bring it back to your purpose and your values, because people are worried about, what's this going to do for my job? Am I going to get Gen AI out of my job? What about my job security? Can I be more effective with Gen AI? Can we make more money doing this? There's so many questions happening. And what I would advise and do advise to leaders is that you don't have to have all the answers. What you do have to have is a solid plan for how you're going to engage your people and go out and find those answers, and then communicate with clarity around that to your people in order to bring them along for the ride and have them feel that they're being consulted, engaged, and have a voice in the process. And if they feel that, then they will go along the ride with you. And if you can continue to bring it back to your organization's values, whatever they are, and say, we're going to conduct this process with fairness, with transparency, with care and consideration for our people, then you can actually build leadership credibility through the process as you're navigating on the foggy road forward.
Howard, I'm curious, when you've got a lot of data from companies that you've been studying in your benchmark, what evidence have you got that kind of supports this view of the not only need for that kind of the visionary leader, but also the systems and structures and processes and culture that companies have that enable them to behave in the way that Kate was just describing?
Absolutely, because if you think about different industry, there are companies that, their new capability getting trapped on one side. And then we have seen future-ready companies, let's say financial world, in the world of finance, then you have leading companies such as Visa and Master. They essentially is able to break up the silo and allow these capabilities to spread all across the world. And it does require two things. One is the culture and mindset, but also infrastructure. So Mark and I have been doing this piece of research to looking at what are the prerequisite and steps that the executive needs to think about when they try to bring new capability, democratize them to spread across a sprawling enterprise. So I'll give you just 3 steps. One is you've got to identify what are the critical capabilities so crucial in the future. So for car company, maybe one thing. For payment company, it would be another thing. But you essentially need a shared viewpoint. Second step, later on we could elaborate a little bit, is you could break up that monolith. You break up that technology stack. And these days there are tools such as application programming interface that allows this to happen so that an organization can really embrace what some people call 2 pizza rule. Small teams collaborate. Meanwhile, all this information is sharing across. And the third one, Mark is really steep into that world, is opening up for the whole new ecosystem. Mark, would you like to remind me again, like what company could encapsulate that whole idea of opening up the entire ecosystem?
I mean, the company that comes to mind is a company that is hard to pronounce, I'm afraid. It's Xiaomi. It's a company that comes originally from China. It has about 45% of their $50 billion business outside of China. So it's a serious player. And it's a company that has realized that there's only so much you can do yourself. And in search for satisfying increasingly complex customer needs, they find out that working together, partnering, investing with other companies, complementers, to build what is actually a best possible offering for the customer is very, very attractive. So actually, as a company like Xiaomi maybe has over 350 companies as part of their ecosystem, while they only themselves make 4 key products. But there is a new product very recently because Xiaomi, as you know, Howard, they launched a car. Otherwise, what they do, phones, electric rice cookers, all kinds of other fun things, but now cars. So is that a possible new capability for the future for a consumer electronics business, Howard? I'm not sure about that.
Right, but it also goes to show, Peter, that across industry, what we have seen is industry convergence. In the past, a car company think they are competing against other automakers. And today they're competing against Xiaomi. And Xiaomi just launched this car. Basically, it's a Porsche knockoff selling around $25,000. And they claim their range on one single charge more than 300 miles. And so, barbarians at the gate.
Well, that's an interesting point because we started out by someone pointing out customer centricity as being, really central to future readiness. And Stephanie, I know you've done a lot of work on that and the ways that companies use technology to organize their capabilities around customer needs.
Well, and I think when Howard talked about you need to move away from the monolith, I think we have to be careful about that because basically we think about what you need to have is you need to have platforms in place, reusable capabilities. And so I want to be careful that people think about them as being modular and configurable and, plug and play. Howard being the Lego professor, we use Lego as a real metaphor a lot of times. But in terms of customer centricity, we're doing some research on what we call domains, and I'll drop a link later into the chat where you talked about is a car. Car companies, a lot of them are moving beyond it's a car, but instead, it's really about mobility, and it's really about that end-to-end need that companies are trying to fulfill. And almost every company that we've talked to that is doing this kind of work, where they're looking at fulfilling an end-to-end need, is partnering and is creating an ecosystem, because it's a rare company that actually has all of the capabilities in place. And you need the ecosystem to do that. And you also will find as you're doing that you're bringing multiple industries together to do it. So you could imagine for, say, property or, buying a house, that you could have your people who are building the house, you could have the people who are selling the house, you could have lawyers, you could have insurance, you could have financing, what's that end-to-end need that you have to fulfill? And that's how we're starting to think about customer centricity. But it's very hard because you need a lot of data. You've got to consolidate your data. You need to be able to integrate it. You need to figure out the partners. It's a challenge.
And Kate, while we're doing the right thing and focusing on customer needs and how do we understand and solve problems for customers, let's, going back to an earlier theme, not forget about our own people. What do you think has been the sort of the impact of these kind of, for example, these technology-driven changes on ourselves, leaders and within the organization, distributed leaders throughout the organization? What are the human consequences of these rapid changes that on our own organizations and people?
Well, they can be positive, they could be negative. It just really depends on how the organization decides to handle it. I've spent my career studying stakeholder value creation, and companies that are the most successful have two key stakeholder groups: their employees and their customers. And their people need to be fully engaged, feel that they have opportunities to grow and develop personally and professionally, and feel that they have enough resources and they're able to pull resources from the organization. And that includes training if they need it on new Gen AI technologies. It includes financial resources, talent to do what they need to do. And so organizations that are able to engage their employees and support them and help them develop and grow in those ways are going to see positive benefits of Gen AI, as well as addressing the big question that's on everybody's mind, which is the job security question. And what's going to happen to me when my job is made irrelevant by Gen AI? Am I going to have an opportunity to continue to transfer to get upskilled into something else at this company? How am I going to be prepared to generate a sustainable livelihood for myself, my family? I mean, these are very personal questions. And so leaders need to address those very personal questions that people have about their own livelihood, the sustainability of their livelihood, and their opportunities to grow and develop professionally. And then organizations that do that and leaders that do that are well positioned to have their employees embrace Gen AI, be excited about it, get trained up on it. And leaders that don't are going to have problems. I'll just leave it right there at that.
Great. We just had a question actually in the Q&A about, there's so much pressure to do more with less and to produce and to perform. And we're asking our people to drive and be involved and be open to all of this change. But at the same time, and this is what Mark was saying earlier as well, is that, the need to perform in the now. And what Mark, have you seen as being other differences as you look between Asian companies and European and US companies in some of those questions, and how they translate into the performance and capability development that you're seeing companies engage in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question of like do more with less, right? In many organizations is, if you look at whether it's Asian organizations or Western European American organizations, in a way the answer is kind of similar, right? So what you want doing more with less is actually to know what you know. So a lot of organizations have lots of knowledge, lots of pockets of knowledge, but it's not really shared across the organization. It's not really scaled across the organization. So we see that companies from the East to the West and everything in between that are successful in preparing themselves for the future are really good at basically scaling up the competences across the organization, which is in a way doing more with less, because we already had the capability somewhere in-house anyhow. And I think we have an example of that, Howard. We did work on an interesting case very recently, wasn't it?
Right. So it's MasterCard. So Mark and I had just completed a case study and talking with the senior executive to understand, how do they essentially perform and transform, not to overwhelm the entire organization. I saw the chat earlier, and some of our audience basically said there are too many emails going around, too much manual coordination, and that leads to burnout. And on top, if we are asking our manager to innovate, it's almost impossible. So it does require to rethink about the organization design, both mindset as well as technology support. So in the case of MasterCard, building on what we just described, they essentially built a platform, a digital backbone behind, so that they could break up what we call the monolith. So if you think about MasterCard historically, everything is a bundle, is the whole transaction. What they have done over time is to break up that so-called transaction into modular component, so that different manager across different geographical market, they could basically open up the drawer, pick and choose different component, and voila, this is the new solution for the end customer to drive value creation. And all these coordination is no longer pick up the phone, it's no longer typing email, but more like a self-service platform to pull out these plug and play model. What this case to Mark and I, the big haha moment is, in order to innovate, you need to make your backyard simple. You need to fix the plumbing. Once you get that done, then you could beginning to transform. Obviously, as you transform, you also perform at the same time. So that goes back to our thesis. It's not a trade-off, but you excel on both sides. But it does require a slightly shift of mindset and the way we frame the problem.
Can I jump in here, Peter?
Please.
So when I hear what Howard and Mark are talking about, it goes back to our research on reuse. And I think that it's not just doing more with less, but it's really a reshifting of the way that you think in terms of, it's part of that developing a platform mindset. But it does mean that you have to take an overall, you have to have this sharing kind of mindset within the organization. And then also, it also helps sometimes, especially if you're talking about some of these modules that are customer facing, it also gives predictability to your customers. But one of the things that we found in our research on reuse was that architecting it right the first time will take a little bit longer, but you get speed to market being fast, much faster, and you get the opportunity to start to change your investment within the organization, because you don't have to spend as much running the company, and you can spend you can spend what you've saved in terms of those modules in terms of transforming the company. And so reuse is one of those ways, that modularity is one of those ways of doing more with less.
That's great. Thank you, Stephanie. I was going to turn to you because I think that when Howard was talking as well, it reminded me about the different paths that you talk about, to different pathways to get to being truly kind of transformed and digital.
And you'll see a lot of reuse early on in companies that industrialize first, but eventually every company has to develop that modularity. And I think it's hard, and I think that we're starting to see companies that are, especially those that have invested in their back end and invested in their people so that their people know what to do with those modules, that you start, but we're continuing to do research on that. Peter and I have a project, Peter Weil, my collaborator, and I have a project on platforms this year, and different kinds of platforms, and how do you develop those reusable capabilities, and then how do you get your people to adopt, leverage, and really get value out of them.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I've just been looking back up at the chat, and there have been a lot of questions and comments about AI. So maybe I could, if everyone will allow me to crowdsource a little bit from all of you who are watching right now, and ask you all a question just to answer in the chat while we continue to talk. And that would be, what is it that you would wish MIT and IMD to be looking into or studying in terms of the impacts and opportunities that you're seeing around AI? What are you concerned about? What are you excited about? If you could just feel free to share those thoughts with us in the chat as we go along. We'll try to continue with that theme as well, and no doubt be able to address them in our future work, which is one of the reasons that we're having this conversation with all of you. I was also wanted to go back to you, Kate. I mean, thinking about this question of sticking on AI, kind of the impacts on individuals, but somebody in the chat asked, or I think in the Q&A, asked a question about intergenerational kind of challenges as well. And we can talk about that from a technology perspective, but I'm really curious from a human perspective. What are you seeing in the organizations that you're studying are, the real challenges? And I think there's a lot of mythology about about intergenerational challenges as well. And so I'm just curious, what's the real data telling you about what's going on in the workforce in that respect?
Well, the most successful companies that I see dealing with intergenerational issues, the leaders of those organizations exhibit humility and are willing to open up the lines of communication. So it's not just top down one way, but it's bottom up two-way directional. So for instance, Adobe has put in place a two-way performance review process that happens 4 times a year. And the intention is for it not just to be a manager to direct report feedback session, but an opportunity to touch base 4 times a year, more frequently than the traditional review, to hear what are the employees' ideas for the organization, what kinds of thoughts do they have about how to advance their own goals, and what feedback do they have for their manager. And so operating with humility, doing some reverse mentoring. A lot of companies have great reverse mentoring programs where, surprisingly, if you ask people, they will tell you what to do and what they want and how to engage this younger generation. People want to be engaged, and it's oftentimes just surprising to me how just easy it is. If you just ask, they'll tell you. Give them an opportunity to engage, and they'll tell you. But I think it requires a shift in leadership mindset where a lot of people got to where they were by filling the room with great ideas, and so putting ideas into the space. And this requires a shift from putting ideas into the space to holding space for people's ideas and for them to educate you. I'm in the generation where I need to be educated about certain things that the younger generation just comes naturally to them. So just ask, they'll tell you. Be open to learning, even if you're, in your 40s, 50s, 60s, that kind of, we heard growth mindset from somebody when we first started this webinar, and that's it, just approach things with curiosity. Somebody else mentioned that. And it's a heck of a lot more fun to do it that way.
That's helpful. Thank you. And Mark, is this a level playing field globally now, or are there still big differences in different parts of the world that you're seeing?
So I think there is clearly not yet a level playing field, and it's a really, really immature technology as well, right? I mean, we're just at the beginning of AI and Gen AI, right? So I think we are seeing lots and lots of different developments, whether we look at the West or we look at the East, we look at China. But the key question around, how level the playing field is how ready companies are to actually leverage AI or generative AI for their purposes, right? And in a way, it's a very simple question. So if I want to use an AI, I need to have something to train it on, to use it on, right? So if my company has not really successfully transformed itself and codified, digitized a lot of their processes, data, and made them available, AI is not going to be very useful, right? So if you don't do the homework, and as Howard referred to earlier, sort of clean up the kitchen, clean up your backyard, it's not really going to add a lot of value, right? Then it becomes a nice project, an experiment here or there. But the real value is going to be in having a really nice codified set of key processes in your organization with key data points on, of course, your customers. And then, yes, you can play with AI. I think that's a really, it's not a very exciting answer, but I think it's a very important answer. Some of the homework needs to be done. And this is the same for China, for the US, and for everywhere in between.
I was going to say that, lots of companies are doing predictive AI right now. But really, if you're going to get value out of the AI and the research that we've done, you have to have a great platform with ability to go and share. You have to have great data that's curated. You have to have the skills in place. You need to have acceptable data use types of, the ethical considerations. And you need to have user understanding. And then you need to have AI explainability, where you understand what the model is, you understand where the bias is, and you need all of those things in place to really get value from AI. And basically, when companies started calling us, my first question was, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And then the second is, start an experiment, because you're all of a sudden going to see where you need to invest and how do you clean that kitchen, as you say.
I think where you were just going there, Stephanie, was started to address what was forming in my head as well, and looking at some of the questions, the comments in the chat, which is there have been many cycles, the so-called hype cycle, for example, of things that are the latest shiny, object that's going to, we've all got to invest in it. It's going to change our world, the world. And some of them, take much longer to really come to fruition, or maybe apparently don't even end up happening at all in the way that was predicted. I think of something like, truly autonomous vehicles, for example, is something that's been 2 years away for 20 years at least. So what do you see as what's your advice to individual leaders and up and coming leaders to really sort of think systematically about what is hype and what is real, and where should they focus?
I think when we're looking at it, you have to be extremely careful with anything that is customer facing. I mean, these models are still, they can hallucinate, they can make stuff up. I mean, I have great awards on my CV if you go and ask, ChatGPT what I've done. I think some experiments and putting guardrails in place around where you're going to use it, creating a sandbox so that you can see how it works. I think the biggest problem, and we even face this at MIT, is how safe is your data? Is your data being let out of the organization? Do you have control over it? But I think figuring out what's a good problem that AI could solve. So if you're thinking about generative AI, where would you create content? Where would it make a difference? If you look at a company like CarMax, one of the big problems that they had was they were not able to get to the top of the search rankings. And one of their teams decided to see if they could write, and they couldn't get to the top because they didn't have descriptions of all of their models. They have 4,000 or 5,000 models on the web at any one time. They did an experiment. They found that they could use generative AI to create, to pull all that data together. And they were able to do something that they predicted would have taken 11 years in a period of 4 or 5 months. And it had really high value out of them. So I think that's the other piece, is where are you going to get the value? The value out of that was they were higher up in the search rankings, shot to the top. They could reposition their people to do more strategic work rather than just filling out all of the, the car stuff. And their customers actually got more data. And so I think you need to look for those opportunities. Where is their value? And what do you have to have in place to go and really make it happen?
That's great. And Howard, maybe we could sort of move beyond AI as well, because as much as clearly AI is now, and there's a lot happening, and there's a lot that we don't know, and people need to be prepared for that uncertain future. But there are many other drivers of uncertainty in our future as well, which presumably the successful future-ready companies have to take account of. So, what are some of the other examples that are front of mind for you?
Yeah, I think this is where we oftentimes think senior leader, their job sometimes is slow things down. As much as we get trapped with the hype of generative AI, before that it was blockchain and then it's IoT, the fundamental question here is asking, like Mark mentioned earlier, what is that 1 or 2 core capability are really important for you? What is essential for someone else, for Nike, may not be useful for you? So if you just gaze towards pharmaceutical, generative AI, you could think about deploying to drug discovery, etc. But if you're Novo Nordisk, you have Ozempic. What you care the most may not be even generative AI, is to think about how do I build the next technology platform so that I can branch out to other therapeutical area. So if you ask me for the contour of what is future-ready organization, in fact, is how do you systematically allow your companies to scale up the next capability? For some, maybe it's advanced robotic. For others, maybe it's energy efficiency. For yet others, could be generative AI. So it's not one size fit all. But what we see between Mark and I in our research, there are basically 3-4 steps that every organization needs to go through in order to scale up that new capability. Cleaning up the kitchen, break up the monolith, democratize that capability, having a shared language framework, and rotate people en masse between the old and the new. These seems to be the generic steps for organization to be 1 inch ahead.
Great. And Sylvie in the Q&A just pointed out that sustainability, in the face of not just climate change, but all the other kind of environmental pressures that we face as a species and as a planet is clearly got to be extremely important. Kate, I know you're doing a lot of work in that kind of space as well about creating sustainable organizations. What are your thoughts about that question?
Yeah, climate change is the biggest existential threat that we face as a species right now globally, at least on the environmental side, of course. There are many others economically, health-wise. I mean, if you look around, you can spot a huge existential threat no matter where you look. And there are, of course, so many opportunities as well. What my research recently has shown is how companies can do their external sense-making effectively. I'll pop a link into chat about when they're setting their sustainability goals, really consulting their stakeholder ecosystem in a very disciplined way to understand what are the trends so that you don't get caught unawares about what some NGO group is going to be pressuring you to do next month, but that you're staying abreast of the changing trends and stakeholder expectations. Bringing that information in and then orienting that around your materiality analysis, your own company's purpose, strategy, business model, etc. So it's that outside in, and then grounding that in what your company is really all about, and using those two sources of information to set your goals, and then scaling them out and communicating them in a way that everybody can get their heads around what to do to advance the goals.
Great, that's super important, and we should never lose sight of that either. I think we're just about at the top of the hour, and we'll need to start wrapping up. And so, if you will all forgive me, I thought maybe I will just try a quick fire, sort of 60-second answer round of questions to each of you now. But I'm going to ask you all the same question, but I'm going to pick on someone first, and that question is maybe to you first, Mark. People are watching this. Thank you, everyone, for engaging so much with us. But if anybody who's watching this either now or the recording, wants to know, what would your advice be to them of what they could do now or next or very soon to help them be that much more future ready themselves and for their organization? So that's same question to all of you, but let's start with Mark.
Sure, thanks, Peter, and great to have everybody here in the chat. It's really fantastic to see the engagement. I mean, the big advice from my side would really be take the outside-in perspective. Go look outside and not just look at other cases. Go and visit, see with your own eyes how other companies organize, feel the culture, and get that. And don't only stick within your industry. Go to industries that look totally irrelevant, but may actually give you a hint at a key or identify a key capability. So that would be my advice.
Great, that's fantastic. So come to open enrollment programs at MIT and IMD, where you can meet lots of people from different industries and parts of the world. Great advice. Stephanie, what should people do now?
I would say work on developing a common language, figuring out what's the ultimate goal, and work on developing a common language throughout the whole organization and get everybody aligned to it.
That's excellent. Very good. Thank you. Howard, what would you say?
I say curiosity. I see the most effective executive these days, they are all very, very curious individuals, because to invest in a new area, you cannot just calculate based on payback return, but you need to have that intrinsic motivation. And that's the essential skill. First step to become future ready. Stay curious.
That's fantastic. And Kate, you have the last word.
I would say just remember that it's about the people in the end. It's about the people. We're not human resources, we're people. And if we keep that in mind, then that'll be a good guiding light through the foggy road into the future.
Well, thank you, Kate. And on that note, you four have all been fantastic people. This has been fascinating and useful. I've learned a lot. Really appreciate everyone who's dialed in and asked great questions and contributed in the chat as well. So thank you all, Stephanie Woerner, Kate Isaacs, Howard Yu, and Mark Greeven, our panelists. Thank you everyone around the world. Thank you to the team at MIT Sloan Executive Education who have put this wonderful webinar together for us. And I hope that we will see you all in future webinars and in future classes at MIT and at IMD.